Hello everyone! I am delighted to be sharing with you today another syntactic category formation that allows us to extend the X schema to functional categories. For the next 30 minutes, allow me to walk you through at how we can modify the generalized X bar rules so that they fit into the more general pattern. In the last chapter, we looked at a refinement of our phrase structure rules that not only accounted for intermediate structure, but also generalized patterns across categories. This refinement is X-bar theory, or the generalized X-bar rules. 1A is a specifier rule that tells that every phrase that is represented by XP must have a bar level of the same category within it that is represented by X apostrophe, optionally preceded by another phrase that is represented by YP. In the phrase, the basketball, the specifier precedes the head. In 1B, we can see that adjuncts can be on either side, like in this phrase. In 1C, the complement rule says that complements are on the right, that is, they follow the head, like what we can see in this phrase. These rules not only generate most of the trees we need for sentences of the world's languages, they also capture the additional properties of hierarchical structure found within the major constituents. This said, you may have noticed that this system is far from perfect. First, there is the status of specifiers. In particular, the specifier rule we proposed earlier requires that the specifier be a phrase or XP level category. However, the only instances of specifiers we've looked at are determiners, which appear not to be phrasal. In this presentation, we will look at determiners and specifiers and propose a new category that fits X-bar theory, a determiner phrase or our DP. We will see that determiners are not specifiers. Instead, we'll claim that the specifier position is used to mark a particular grammatical function, that of subjects. You will see that specifiers of all categories are where subjects go. In the X-bar rules in 1, you'll note that the only obligatory element is the head. Another troubling aspect of the X-bar theory is the exceptional CP and TP rules that we have yet to incorporate into the system. In the sentence rules in 2, the opposite is true. The only optional element is the head itself. Thus, these rules do not fit the X-bar theory. In this presentation, we will look at how we can modify these so that they fit into the more general pattern. So let's take the journey of extending X-bar theory to functional categories. And for our learning objectives, we will identify the rules that do not fit the X-bar pattern, and we will extend the same X-bar schema to functional categories such as the determiners, tenses, and complementizers. In the last chapter, for lack of a better place to put them, we put determiners like the or the, a, that, this, those, these in the specifiers of NPs or our noun phrases. This, however, violates one of the basic principles underlying the X-bar theory, and that is all non-head material must be phrasal. Notice that this principle is a theoretical rather than an empirical requirement, but it is a nice idea from a mathematical point of view, and it would be good if we could show that it has some empirical basis. One thing to note about determiners is that they are heads. There can only be one of them in an NP, though this isn't true cross-linguistically, but for now, let us limit ourselves to English. And this is illustrated in the sentence or in the phrase number 3, which is the that book. In other words, they don't seem to be phrasal. If our requirement says that the only thing that isn't a phrase in an NP is the N itself, then we have a problem. One solution, perhaps not obvious, to this is to claim that the determiner is not actually inside the NP. Instead, it has its own phrasal projection, and this was first proposed by Abney in 1987. Determiners in this view are not part of the NP. Instead, the NP is a complement to the determiner head. Now, this solution solves the theoretical problem of the non-phrasality of the D or determiner, but we still need empirical evidence in its favor. If you could see in number 4, we are trying to contrast the old view and the determiner phrase hypothesis. One piece of evidence comes from the behavior of genitive or the possessive NPs. Now, there are two kinds of possessive NPs. The first is of less interest to us. This one is often called the free genitive or of genitive. Now let's look at number 5, A, B, and C, where we have the following phrases: the coat of the panther, the roof of the building, and the hat of the man standing over there, which all have the of genitive. The free genitive uses the preposition of to mark the possessive relation between the two NPs. More important in terms of evidence for DP is the behavior of the other kind of possessive, and that is the construct or the apostrophe S genitive. 6ABC would show how the construct or the S genitive is used. The panther's coat, the building's roof, and the man standing over there's hat. There are a couple of important things to note about this construction. Notice first that the apostrophe S marker appears after the entire possessor NP. For example, it attaches to the whole phrase "the man standing over there," not just to the head man. As illustrated in 7A, the man standing over there's hat, and in 7B, the man's standing over there hat. This means that the apostrophe S is not a suffix. Instead, it seems to be a small word indicating possession. Next, note that it is in complementary distribution with determiners. As illustrated in 8A, that is, the building's the roof compared to the roof of the building. In 8B, the panther's the coat compared to the coat of the panther. In 8C, the man standing over there's the hat compared to the hat of the man standing over there. Unlike the of genitive, the apostrophe S genitive does not allow both the nouns to have a determiner. In other words, the apostrophe S and determiners are in complementary distribution. As in other domains of linguistics, when two items are in complementary distribution, they are instances of the same thing. Determiners like the and apostrophe S are different tokens of the same type. Assuming that apostrophe S is a determiner, and assuming the DP hypothesis holds true, we can now account for the positioning of the apostrophe S relative to the possessor. The apostrophe S occupies the head D position, and the possessor appears in its specifier, and this is clearly illustrated in the tree found in 9. Now let's look at the tree for 8C, which is shown in number 10. That is, the man standing over there's the hat. Notice that in the tree illustrated in 10, there is a specifier of DP, filled by DP2. Note further that this specifier is phrasal, that is, projects to an XP, which means that it meets with our requirement that all non-head material be phrasal. The possessor DP2, the man standing over there, sits in the specifier of DP1, which is headed by apostrophe S. So apostrophe S follows the whole thing. Notice that with our old theory where determiners were specifiers of NP, there is no way at all to generate apostrophe S as a determiner and to also have the possessor NP preceding it. Just take a look on the tree illustrated in number 11. The X-bar rules don't provide any place to attach this predeterminer NP if determiners are specifiers. Now you might ask if by moving determiners out of the specifier, we have completely destroyed the empirical justification for the specifier rule. Actually, we haven't. Again, if you look closely at the tree in number 10, we will still have a specifier, it just isn't T1. Instead, it is the DP possessor or the DP2. So we are done with the first segment of the presentation. So as a summary, let's take a look on this interim summary part where we look at the different important or salient points discussed in the first segment. First is determiner is not actually inside the NP, but it heads its own phrasal projection based on the idea of Abney in 1987. Then we also have this important point about the DP hypothesis, which tells that determiners are not part of the NP, and instead the NP is a complement to the determiner head. Also, we were exposed to the different pieces of evidence for DP. The first is the genitive or the possessive NPs, which give us the two kinds of genitives, the free genitive and the off genitive. Then the use of the apostrophe S marker, which is in complementary distribution with our determiners. Moving on, let's have now the clause types. Now, what is a clause? A clause is essentially a subject, usually a DP that has the property indicated by the predicate. This is what the clause is about. And a predicate phrase, or a group of words that assign a property to the subject. Now, the most obvious kind of clause is a simple sentence. In the following examples, the subject is indicated in italics and the predicate phrase is in bold. So we have in 12a, which we have the sentence, a boy ran. We know obviously that the subject here is the boy and the predicate phrase or the predicate is the word ran. In 12b, Howard is a linguistics student. We say here that the subject is Howard and the predicate phrase is the linguistics student. A clause that stands on its own is called a root, matrix, or main clause. Sometimes, however, we can find examples of clauses within clauses. Examples of these are seen below. In 13a, we have Peter said that Danny danced, and B, Bill wants Susan to live. In each of these sentences, there are two clauses. In sentence 13a, there is the clause that Danny danced, which is inside the root clause Peter said that Danny danced. In 13b, we have the clause Susan to live, which is the subject Susan and the predicate phrase to live. This is contained within the main clause, Bill wants Susan to live. Both of these clauses within clauses are called embedded clauses. Another name for embedded clause is subordinate clause. The clause containing the embedded clause is still called the main or the root clause. Now, using the TP and CP rules we developed in Chapter 3, the structure of a root clause containing an embedded clause is given in the illustrated tree in number 14. Now, let's take a look at this tree. For the sentence, Peter said that Danny danced. Now, looking into the tree presented here, you will notice that our main clause is the TP, which is the root of the whole sentence, while our embedded clause is the TP that Danny danced. Now, within each clause, we can identify the various verbs, and they are the verb said and the verb danced. Another thing is the two verb phrases are the predicate phrases, and our two DPs are the subjects, which are Peter and Danny. In addition to the distinction between main and embedded clauses, we can also distinguish among specifier, complement, and adjunct clauses. Here are some examples of complement clauses. In 15a, Heidi said that Art loves peanut butter, and 15b, Colin asked if they could get a mortgage. These complement clauses, that Art loves peanut butter, and if they could get a mortgage, are sisters to the verb and thus complements. Clauses can also appear in adjunct positions. Relative clauses are one example of adjunct clauses that is illustrated in the sentence number 16. The man I saw get into the cab robbed the bank. The relative clause in 16, I saw get into the cab, modifies the head man. Specifier clauses are ones that serve as the subject of a sentence, which is clearly seen below. In 17a, people selling their stocks caused the crash of 1929, and 17b, for Mary to love that boor is a travesty. We could see here that the people selling their stocks and for Mary to love that boor are the subject of a sentence, and they are actually called the specifier clauses. To summarize, we have two basic kinds of clauses, to main and embedded. Embedded clauses are contained within main clauses. Further, there are three types of embedded clauses. We have the specifier clauses, complement clauses, and adjunct clauses. And this is summarized in the following table seen in 18. There is another way of dividing up the clause type pie. We class clauses into two groups depending upon whether they are tensed or not. Clauses with predicates that are tensed are sometimes called tense clauses, but you may more frequently find them called finite clauses. Clauses without a tensed verb are called tenseless or non-finite clauses, or sometimes they are also called the infinitival clauses. Let's take a look on the sentences in number 19. Like in A, I said that Mary signed my yearbook. This is actually a tense or finite clause. This because we can see here the past tense of the verb signed. In 19b, I want Mary to sign my yearbook. This is tenseless or non-finite because obviously the clause uses the infinitive type to sign. There are a number of tests for distinguishing finite from non-finite clauses, and these tests are taken from Radford in 1988. The embedded clause in sentence in 20a is tensed. The one in 20b is untensed. One way to tell if a clause is finite or not is to look for agreement and tense morphology on the verb. These include the S ending associated with the third person nouns like in the sentence he eats, and the past tense suffixes like ed. The examples given in 20 don't show any such suffixes. However, if we change the tense to the past, a difference emerges, as seen in 21a and b. 21a states that I know you ate asparagus is a finite clause or has a finite clause, and 21b, I've never seen you ate asparagus, contains the non-finite clause. Finite clauses allow past tense morphology, that is the ate form of the verb eat, and non-finite clauses don't. The same effect is seen if we change the person of the subject in the embedded clause. Third-person subjects trigger the S ending, and this is allowed only in finite clauses. That is actually seen in 22A and B, where I know he eats asparagus, containing the finite clause, and B, I've never seen him eat asparagus, is having the non-finite clause. The case on the subject of the noun is often a giveaway for determining whether or not a clause is finite. Now the case refers to the notions nominative and accusative as introduced in Chapter 1 is also repeated here. So that is clearly seen in the table presented in number 23, where we have the different cases of pronouns, the nominative case, accusative, and anaphoric. If the clause is finite, then a subject pronoun will take the nominative case form as given in number 24 sentence, that is, I know he eats asparagus, and this is finite. If the clause is non-finite, then the subject will take the accusative form as clearly illustrated in number 25, where I've never seen him eat asparagus, having a non-finite clause. One test that works most of the time but is not as reliable as the others is to see if the subject is obligatory. Now, if the subject is obligatory, then the clause is finite. If the subject is optional or is not allowed at all, then it is not finite. We have these sentences in 26A. I think that he eats asparagus compared to I think that eats asparagus with finite clause. And 26B, I want him to eat asparagus compared to I want to eat asparagus with the non-finite clause. Another way to tell if a clause is finite or not is by looking at the complementizer. Now, the complementizer for is only found with non-finite clauses, and by contrast, that and if are only found with tense clauses. Now, look at the sentences in 27A and B having if and that. That's why they are called, or they have the finite clauses. I wonder if he eats asparagus, and I think that he eats asparagus. On the other hand, 27C, these sentences are having the non-finite clauses. For him to eat asparagus is a travesty. I asked for him to eat the asparagus. These two sentences have the non-finite clauses. Now, as a final test, we can note that finite and non-finite clauses take different kinds of T elements. Now, the T in tense clauses can contain the auxiliaries and modals like will, can, must, may, should, shall, is, and have. By contrast, the only auxiliary allowed in non-finite clauses is to. Now, take a look on the sentences found in 28. I think he will eat asparagus. This contains the modal will, and therefore it is finite. In B, I want him to eat asparagus compared to I want him will eat asparagus. So this is a sentence containing the non-finite clause. This last property gets at the heart of the distinction between finite and non-finite clauses. In structural terms, the difference between a finite and a non-finite clause lies in terms of what kind of T the clause has. If a clause is finite, it bears some tense feature like the past or the future. If it is non-finite, it doesn't have any of these features. Now, let us summarize the discussion we had thus so far in this segment or part. You see, we've been looking at a number of important points and important terms here in describing clauses and its types. So as what we have said, clause contains a subject and the predicate phrase, and the two types are the embedded and the root or the main clauses. Under the embedded clauses, we have these types: the specifier, the adjunct, and the complement clauses. And the types of verbal, we have the tense or finite versus the untense or non-finite. Now, in terms of the test of finiteness, we have here the basis in terms of inflection of the verbs, the case of the pronouns, the complementizers, and the tense of the verbs. We might ask how pervasive this rule is in our mental grammars. That is, do all clauses have CPs? Or do only embedded clauses have CPs? On the surface, the answer to this question seems obvious, that only embedded clauses have CPs, since only embedded clauses appear to allow complementizers. And these are clearly illustrated in the sentences found in 31. 31A says that John thinks that asparagus is yummy, and 31B that asparagus is yummy compared to asparagus is yummy. However, there is evidence that all clauses, even root clauses like presented in 31, require some kind of complementizer, as seen in the sentence number 32. In particular, we'll claim that some sentences have null complementizers. That is, these are the complementizers that can be omitted. Now, the tree in number 33 shows one of these null complementizers. The evidence for this claim comes from cross-linguistic comparison of questions among languages. In particular, we'll focus on the yes or no questions, and these are the questions that can be answered with either yes, no, or maybe. Examples of yes or no questions in English are given in the following sentences stated in number 34. 34A is, did John live? While 32.4b, have you seen Lois? In English, to form a yes or no question, you either insert some form of the verb do, does, or did before the subject, or you invert the subject and the auxiliary, as seen in this sentence, you have seen Lois, which will become have you seen Lois. Now, this operation is called the subject-aux inversion. In many other languages, however, the yes or no questions are formed with a complementizer particle that precedes the verb. Take, for example, Irish, which indicates yes or no questions with a special particle R or its allomorph an. You see here in number 35. Languages like English that use subject-aux inversion don't have special complementizer question particles. The opposite also holds true. If a language has complementizer question particles, then it won't have subject-aux inversion. The phenomena are in complementary distribution. It seems reasonable to claim then that question complementizers and subject-aux inversion are part of the same basic phenomenon. Now, in order to make this concrete, let's make the following proposal. There is a question complementizer particle in English, just like there is in Irish. Now, the difference is that in English, this complementizer particle is null. That is, it has no phonological content, but it must be realized or pronounced some way. The way English satisfies this requirement is by moving T into the C head, and you would notice that in the tree found in number 36. This results in the correct order where the auxiliary in T now appears before the subject. By contrast, languages like Irish don't utilize this mechanism. Instead, they have a particle that fills their null complementizer, like the R or an in Irish. English does in fact have an overt null complementizer, but it is only found in embedded questions. This complementizer is if. Unsurprisingly, subject-aux inversion is completely disallowed when if is present. Now look at the sentences found in 37. 37A, Fabio asked if Klaus had run a marathon. B, Fabio asked if had Klaus run a marathon. C, Fabio asked had if Klaus run marathon. These are the sentences containing the if. While D, Fabio asked had Klaus run a marathon doesn't have. If occupies the null complementizer, so no subject-aux inversion is required or allowed. Now, given the existence of overt root complementizers in other languages, and the evidence that subject-aux inversion patterns like these, overt root complementizers, we can conclude that, for questions at least, there are complementizers and CPs present even in main clauses. Of course, we haven't yet shown that non-question sentences have a root complementizer. For this, we need to add an extra step in the argument. Now, you can only conjoin identical categories. If sentences showing subject-aux inversion use a null complementizer, and if you can conjoin that question with a non-question, such as a statement, then that statement must also include a null complementizer and CP. It is indeed possible to conjoin a statement with a question. Now look at number 38. You can lead a horse to water, but will it drink? Notice here that there is what you call the conjoining of statements with a question. Since the second clause here shows subject-aux inversion, we know there is a null question complementizer present. Well, by extension, we know that the clause it is conjoined with must also have a complementizer. This time, a non-question, null, and a CP can only be conjoined with another CP. And this is illustrated in the tree in number 39. This is an argument for null complementizers attached to root clauses, even in simple statements. So from this point forward, we will assume that there is a CP on top of every clause. Now, the following are the important things to remember based on this part of our presentation and discussion. 1. Some sentences have null complementizers. Second, there are pieces of evidence for the null complementizers form. One is the use of the yes or no questions and the subject-aux inversion. And many other languages form the yes or no questions with a complementizer particle that precedes the verb. English does in fact have an overt complementizer, but it is only found in embedded questions, and this complementizer is a use of the word if. Now, for questions at least, there are complementizers and CPs present even in main clauses. And the last one is, there is always a CP on top of every clause. The fourth part of our presentation is all about the tense phrases or our TPs. The other rule that doesn't fit the expert pattern is our S rule that is presented in number 40. Assimilating this rule to expert theory results in a structure like the following tree found in number 41. In this tree, S is replaced by TP. The subject DP sits in the specifier of TP, and the VP is a complement. Again, the problem here is that the element that we have designated as the head of the phrase T is apparently optional. In expert theory, we always have to remember that heads are the only obligatory element. Now, remember in Chapter 2, we equated T with auxiliary verbs. But we might ask, what happens in clauses where there is no auxiliary? Is there a TP? Is there a T? Can we make the same claim we did for CPs that the C is obligatory? Now, in order to answer this question, let's make the following observation. And that is, tense inflection on a verb is in complementary distribution with auxiliaries. Look at the sentences found in number 42. 42A, the roadrunner walks funny. 42B, the roadrunner is walking funny. 42C, the roadrunner is walking funny. Recall that when two elements are in complementary distribution, then they are instances of the same category. This means that T is both auxiliaries and inflectional endings on verbs. Meanwhile, similar evidence comes from coordination. Recall that you can only coordinate two items that are of the same category and bar level. In the following sentence, we are conjoining a T that has an auxiliary with a T that has a tense verb. The tense inflection and auxiliary are italicized. So look at the sentence found in number 43. This evidence suggests that the two T's are identical in some deep sense. That is, they both involve a T note, one auxiliary, the other a tense inflectional ending. If we think about the basic order of the elements, we seem to have argued ourselves into a corner. Remember, auxiliaries appear on the left of verbs, and inflectional suffixes like ed and s appear on the right. Now, this is clearly seen in the sentences found in number 44. 44A, he will go. You will notice here that the auxiliary will appears on the left of the verb go, while in 44B, he goes, we have here the inflectional suffix es that is appearing on the right of the verb go. There are other differences between auxiliaries and inflectional suffixes. For example, auxiliaries but not suffixes undergo subject-aux inversion. If we are to claim that inflectional suffixes and auxiliaries are both instances of T, we have to account for these differences. Now, one possibility is to claim that both inflectional suffixes and auxiliaries are indeed generated under T. They differ, however, in terms of whether they can stand alone or not. Remember again, auxiliaries are independent words and can stand alone. By contrast, suffixes like s and ed have to be attached to a verb. Much like the case of moving T to C in order to pronounce the null, we might hypothesize that endings like s and ed can't be pronounced in isolation, so they move to attach to the verb. In particular, they seem to lower onto the verb. The following tree shows how this would work for the simple sentence, he walked. This sentence starts out as he, then we have the suffix ed, walk. Then the ed ending lowers to attach to the end of the verb. Notice that both the movements we have proposed, that is T affix lowering and T to C, have morphophonological motivations. Auxiliaries move to null to pronounce it. Inflectional endings lower to V since they are verbal suffixes. Now, our understanding about the tense phrases or our TPs will remind us of the following. That is, both inflectional suffixes and auxiliaries are indeed generated under T. Second, auxiliaries are independent words and can stand alone, while suffixes like s and ed have to be attached to a verb. Another is, a more modern approach doesn't have the affixes generated in T. Instead, there are two tense markers, both of which are null, the past and present. The past simply requires that its VP complement be in a past tense or preterite form, and the present requires that its VP complement be in a present tense form. We are now on the last part of the presentation that gives a tree drawn in section 6.2 of chapter 6, but this time with the inclusion of CP, TP, and DP. Look at the figure or the tree in number 46. Now, by looking closely at it, we can observe the following. First, this tree has the subject DP and the specifier of TP. Next, the past tense ending is in T and lowers to the verb. You will also notice that we have a null complementizer. And in addition, you will also note that all NPs or noun phrases are complements to our DPs. I am very grateful that you have tuned in. Thank you very much for your time and patience. This is Jessica L. Palma, your reporter.